He wasn't much to look at, this cat, scrawny with mismatched ears and a coat the color of dust. He wandered into the junkyard one day, likely chasing a rat or just desperate for a haven. The yard was a noisy, greasy, metal-strewn chaos, not a place for the faint of heart, whether human or feline. But this cat, he just sauntered in, tail held high, and claimed the place as his own. The workers, grizzled and tough, didn't take much notice at first. They were men of steel and sweat, more accustomed to the roar of engines than the purr of a cat. Yet, this cat, he had a way about him. He'd weave between stacks of tires, a furry shadow among the rusting hulks. He'd rub against their legs, a silent plea for a scratch behind the ears. They called him Rusty, a name as fitting as the kingdom he'd adopted. Rusty wasn't picky. He'd share a crust of sandwich with anyone, purring his thanks with rough-tongued licks. He'd nap in the sunbeams that sliced through the grimy windows of the office, a splash of warmth in the cool metal jungle. He even learned to tolerate the resident dog, a lumbering old hound named Diesel, the two of them sharing a wary truce. Rusty, you see, he wasn't just surviving in the junkyard, he was thriving. He was becoming family. Life in the junkyard was tough, but it was honest. You worked hard, you got your hands dirty, and you looked out for your own. That's how it was, always had been. But then one sweltering summer afternoon, something happened that shook the very foundation of the yard. There was a new guy, Kenny, just a kid really, all bravado and bad decisions. He'd been mouthing off all day, trying to prove something he wasn't. Then, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the yard, Kenny did the unthinkable. Someone heard a hiss, a startled yowl. Then there was Rusty, streaked with bright blue paint, his eyes wide with fear and confusion.
What in the hell did you do?
Big Joe, the foreman, a man who could bench press a small car, saw red. He grabbed Kenny by the collar, his voice dangerously low.
It was just a dare, thought it was funny.
Big Joe looked down at Rusty, the cat trembling, the blue paint a cruel mockery on his fur. And something in him snapped.
Get out and don't come back!
Kenny, blustering at first, was quickly cowed. He knew, as did everyone else, that Big Joe's word was law in the junkyard. He left muttering curses, the blue paint can rolling across the concrete like a forgotten tear. Word of Kenny's cruelty spread through the junkyard like wildfire. Men who wouldn't think twice about facing down a rabid dog were outraged. Rusty, their Rusty, had been violated. This wasn't just a prank, it was an act of cowardice, of disrespect. Big Joe, his jaw set, cleaned Rusty as best he could. The blue paint wouldn't come off entirely, but at least the cat was no longer trembling. Kenny, however, wasn't done. He went crying to his uncle, a lawyer with more ambition than scruples. Next thing anyone knew, Big Joe was served with papers. Wrongful termination. The lawyer painted Kenny as a victim, Big Joe as a tyrant. The case, it seemed, was open and shut, but what the lawyer didn't count on was the loyalty of the junkyard crew. They all showed up in court, a sea of grease-stained overalls and calloused hands. They told the judge about Rusty, about how he wasn't just a stray, but family. They spoke of Big Joe's fairness, his compassion. The judge, a stern woman with eyes that missed nothing, listened patiently. When it was Kenny's turn to speak, his lies faltered under the weight of the junkyard crew's honesty. The judge's ruling was swift and unexpected. She ruled in favor of Big Joe, stating that Kenny's actions constituted animal cruelty, a valid reason for termination. The lawyer sputtered, Kenny fumed, but the junkyard crew, they just nodded. Justice, it seemed, had a way of prevailing, even in the most unlikely of places. The blue paint faded over time, but the memory of that day never did. It became a part of the junkyard's law, a reminder that even in a place as tough as this, there was a line you didn't cross. As for Rusty, he seemed to shake off the incident with the resilience of his kind. He continued to rule his kingdom, a furry overlord, dispensing purrs and head bumps with equal generosity. The workers, if anything, became even more protective of their feline companion. A warm blanket appeared in his favorite napping spot. Cans of tuna magically materialized beside his water bowl. Rusty, it seemed, had become a symbol of the junkyard's heart, proof that even in the grit and grime, compassion could bloom. Years passed, seasons turned, the junkyard hummed with its own rhythm of clanging metal and roaring engines. Rusty, no longer a spry young cat, had slowed down a bit. His once bright coat was now flecked with grey, his steps a little slower, but his spirit remained indomitable.